Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the third installment of our Risk Revealed webcast series, The Future of Due Diligence, Third-Party Risk in the Era of COVID-19. My name is Stephanie Radcliffe, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Canada at REFINITIV and your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, some technical points to note. There is no dial-in number for audio. Please use your device's sound and plug in your headphones to listen to the webinar. Click the Flash player on your screen to enable sound, the media player, my apologies, and ensure that Flash is enabled on your browser. If the slides are stuck, please refresh your browser. At the bottom of your audience console, you'll see a toolbar with multiple widgets that you can use. If you have any technical difficulties during the webcast, please click on the Help widget. It's a question mark icon, and it covers common technical issues. You can also expand your slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the window, or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area to expand. At the top right corner of your audience console is the Q&A box. Please submit your questions in this box. Our presenters will try to answer as many questions as they can, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. We do capture all questions. Now, there will be a few poll questions throughout the session. We want to keep this an interactive session, so please do answer the poll questions and submit any questions. Finally, the link to the recorded webcast, a copy of the slides, and other resources will be emailed to you after the conclusion of the event. You may also access the webcast on demand using the same audience link that you used today. Now, I'm pleased to announce the speakers for today. First, we have Holly Philippi, who is the Head of Market Development for the Americas Risk Business at REFINITIV. Linda Rogers is the Global Compliance Manager at Pentair PLC. Kelly Slavitt is a General Counsel. And Thomas Fox is an author and lawyer who's also known as the Compliance Evangelist. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Holly to get us started. Holly?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introductions. So as we get started, I know we just did a quick intro of the panelists, but what I am going to ask is that each one of the panelists do a quick intro with a little bit of background themselves, just so that everybody on the line can put a voice to a face, given our virtual environment. So if we can do a quick round of intros, and I'll start with Tom first.
Sure, and thanks. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist. I blog every day at the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog. I'm the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network. I try to write, think, talk, and generally pontificate on all things FCPA and compliance.
Great, thank you, Tom. And as you can see, he has the cool factor going on with the microphone. So I'll kick it over to Linda next.
Hi, this is Linda Rogers. I'm the Global Compliance Manager with Pentair. Been with Pentair about 22 years. I spent time in the finance department, being the supervisor of finance. I'm into legal and compliance for the past 15 years, and so I've had a wealth of experience with purchasing and SOX integration, and then finally the ethics and compliance. So it's been a great journey.
Thank you, Linda. And Kelly?
Thanks, Holly. Hi, I'm Kelly Slavitt. Thank you for inviting me. I've been the general counsel at numerous companies where I set up and managed compliance, risk, and M&A. I started my career at Skadden Arps in their M&A department, and then I moved around the world a bit and in-house to the ASPCA, General Electric, GE, and then Reckitt Benckiser, RB, which is the maker of Lysol, which has been so popular lately.
Very popular. All right, great. Thank you. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to certainly talk about the future of due diligence, hot topic, certainly risk. And then what does that look like with a bit of the pre-COVID and post-COVID? We are going to talk about a few stats. And as Stephanie mentioned at the very beginning, we are going to have a couple of poll questions as well. So REFINITIV does an annual survey each year. So you'll see some stats that came out of the survey that we did. We had over 3,000 organizations that were surveyed. And there was a couple of key things that we wanted to call out because it's going to start to frame our conversation today that we have with all of the panelists. So one of the things that came up is that was highlighted is 43% of our respondents do not receive due diligence checks on their third parties. And that was according to all of the responses. So that number, you'll hear us reference that a little bit further with the panel, just talking about, what does that mean that you have about 43% of your third parties that actually do not go through that third party due diligence process. Then if we look over, we had 53 of the respondents in the report would report a third-party breach internally, and only 16% were reporting that externally as well. So a couple of stats to get us started, just for context as we start to move into the discussion, because it frames a couple of things. One is, what are we doing pre-COVID from a due diligence perspective? What aspects have maybe changed, in the COVID environment, and then I'll say post-COVID, as far as the due diligence that needs to be done on the third parties. And then as we start to talk a little bit about, the regulatory guidance and some things that we're seeing there later on, we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean for, a reporting internally and externally. So I did mention polls. We've mentioned it twice. We want to make sure this is interactive. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off actually with our very first poll question. You can see that at the top. You'll be able to go through, and we're going to give you a little bit of time to answer. So in our report, respondents said that the number one reason to conduct due diligence on third parties was to protect your company from reputational damage. Given what's happened so far in 2020, what would you pick now as the most important reason? Going to give that a little bit of time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and let's talk a little bit about all of the results that we see right here. So protect your company from reputational damage. We had about 21.6. Protect your company from financial damage, 27.5. Equal, ensure your third parties are being compliant with regulations. And then compliance with regulators is 17.6. So certainly a bit of a change, from what we saw in the initial survey that we did pre-COVID, and then what we're seeing here, not significantly different, but definitely a change from reputational into financial, and then making sure that the third parties are compliant. So I want to kick it off to Tom. Does any of this surprise you that pre-COVID, the number one response was protection from reputational damage? And as we look at the responses that we just received now, we've got about equal for number one is protecting the company from financial damage. And then the secondary one, ensure that your third parties are being compliant. Does any of that surprise you at all?
I would say it just gives me additional information, and it tells me that risks have changed. Even in the time of the era of COVID-19, if we can say maybe mid-March when things got shut down, companies are seeing increased risks around financial damage, but they're also seeing increased risks around third parties being in compliance with regulations. That may tie into a potential financial damage, but it also could demonstrate the difficulties that companies are having in managing their third-party relationships, just as they are in managing employment relationships, managing customer relationships in a much more virtual economy. So I think it's additional information that every compliance practitioner and even business executive needs to understand, that your risk can change literally within a couple of months. So I find that part of it quite interesting.
Great. So Linda, based off of what we just saw in the survey results, but then also what Tom mentioned, right, that some of the things influencing that, maybe some of that change in the response is how you're managing, the employees, the virtual environment, et cetera, and how is that impacting your due diligence process? So how has that been for you, moving to the virtual environment? How has that been on your due diligence process?
Well, it becomes even more critical, right? For us, we have employees in some regions that have had very much difficulty keeping a connection to the internet. So in order for us to actually do our due diligence, typically they're doing entry into a compliance portal, and they're having to enter that data. With them not having internet access, a lot of times now it's being a phone call right into the compliance department, so the compliance department can help them do the entry to make sure that we're screening. But then on top of it, our business sponsors and the managers have often complained that it's difficult because they can't travel, right? So for them to not be able to travel, what they used to be able to do is walk into someone's office and get a feel that this is a good company. They have, security around the building. They have an established finance department, and they don't get that anymore. So now what they're running into is they're picking up information via phone calls and via RFQs and things like that. So it's been a little bit more of a challenge for them to get a good feel, to feel confident about the information that they're getting, right? So they're getting it second or third hand, maybe from the department, the actual potential partner itself, where they're sending a business registration and they're giving the list of officers, but less gut feel. And our team typically really does do a lot based on gut feel, where they actually go out and visit sites and they get that good feel, or and they get the information, the legal information at the same time. So it's been a little bit of a challenge there. And for us, is what we've done is staffed our compliance department 24/7, so that if by chance someone can't get to the internet, but they can make a telephone call, they can call us. We also are meeting more often with our sponsors, and we're sending a lot more reminders about those critical things, right? To look for ask for business cards, check the spelling of names. What does their website look like? Do they look like they've got a compliance department? So we do a lot more education and a lot more meeting with our sales teams and our purchasing teams.
So it's interesting, right? As when you don't have that face to face, and you kind of have that gut feel and what makes you feel better. So staffing the 24/7. Has that been a significant change? We probably had a couple hours where there wasn't coverage before. Now it's just ensured, even on what typically most of us would get a Saturday off. Now we're actually staffing Saturdays too. So that it is a change for my limited team, but they're being very accommodating, right? So everyone's willing to take a shift and do it even on like we don't wait for Monday, we don't wait for Sunday. We are there no matter what. So it's just one of those things. I think our ELT is very supportive, and they've said, hey, if you are staffing on a weekend, then you take extra time during the week, right? So we've got a very good support system, and I think that's really key too. Yeah, I think it's something that always comes up, no matter what the question or changes or current, continuing on the process is when you have that ELT support. It makes a world of difference.
Yeah, and them
support you through those changes.
Thank you all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Especially as we navigate the current environment. So one of the things that we've seen come up, and it's been interesting because you'll see I have some stats up here, mergers and acquisition trends, and I've read multiple articles and just kind of watching what some of the sentiment is around this, and a lot of times what we're hearing is they anticipate a downtick. Some are anticipating an uptick. I would say from our experience from REFINITIV side, we've actually seen an uptick in activity on mergers and acquisitions as well, which is something that, has the ability to be impacted, kind of a pre-COVID mid-environment, just on how you do that due diligence. To your point, right? You can walk into somebody's office, you can have certain conversations where that's a little bit different. So Kelly, I'd like to get your thoughts as we just talked about some of the things, right, impacting just our regular day-to-day due diligence processes on third party. As we start to look at the increase in activity that we're seeing within, kind of the M&A space. What do you see? What have you seen that the pandemic itself, how is this affecting M&A, and what do you think that we need to keep in mind as compliance officers?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Yeah, I think the last M&A deal that I worked on, much of our information was already digitized, so it made it a whole lot easier to put it into the data room. And I think in this day and age where everybody's working remotely, companies that have done that already are certainly going to be ahead of the curve when they're going to put their stuff into the data room. We had so many countries that didn't have things digitized and they still had paper copies that it would make an M&A deal right now very difficult because those people can't go into the office and get those documents. So as far as the due diligence, which of course is nothing more than risk management in an M&A context right now, in the pre-acquisition phase, before the LOI is signed, providing the reps and the warranties to the buyer and everything that you need, getting as much data and transparency as possible during this due diligence risk management process is even more critical. I was on a call with an MD at a PE firm recently, and he said that the closing cycles will be longer in the short run to allow for these new virtual due diligence practices. So even the PE firms, which are very active and very hungry right now, which I'll talk to in a minute, are recognizing that it's going to take more time to do due diligence now. And I think concretely, the pandemic is affecting this M&A pre-acquisition phase in a number of key ways that I just wanted to speak to. I think the first one is the purchase price and the funding are in flux right now. The valuation of the target is in flux for purchase price purposes, and so is the valuation of the payment and consideration of the buyer, especially where the purchase price includes a significant amount of stock of the buyer, or the stock comprises a significant portion of the overall consideration. The stock market is going up and down, and companies' values are going up and down, and so how do you actually value a company? How sustainable will it be in Q3, Q4, Q1 of next year? So these are going to make it very difficult. I think it's also difficult for the target company because they might want to engage in some type of reverse diligence to ensure that the funding is secured and that it's properly valued, just to make sure, especially if it's stock that's being paid with. And then the second thing, I think the target, as always, needs to be fully vetted through a comprehensive due diligence process. But this is really difficult in private company acquisitions. The target has not been subject to the scrutiny of public markets, and the buyer has little or no ability to obtain the information they need from public sources. So this is where getting private reports is really key to the extent that information is available. The third thing is to really critically examine the target company's customers and their future pipeline. Who are the top 20 customers and what revenue is generated from each of them? This is a fairly typical question that you would ask, but how stable are these customers as a business in a post-COVID world? This is a level of due diligence that needs to be added now in the post-COVID-19 world. And then I think the fourth thing is you need to do the same for the suppliers and also for your BCP, for your backup continuity suppliers. Not only due diligence as to whether these businesses will still be in business, but do they have the materials that they need to produce or develop the products? Can that be sourced? Are those in short supply or subject to shortages? And if so, how can you ensure that your company is the one that will be supplied as opposed to other companies like your competitors? Look also at the decreased resources in the entire supply chain. This is one that I really think is going to be impacted. Look at transportation, for example. A decrease in the number of drivers or redirection of resources previously used to maintain the trucks will result in fewer transportation options, and that impacts the acquirer's availability to get products to its warehouses, retailers, and customers, which could result in breach of contract, reduced sales, damaged relationships, et cetera. And then the fifth thing is the workers. Key people are typically retained after the acquisition to ensure business continuity for a certain period of time. So what is the likelihood of their retention following the closing? with the pandemic causing so many companies to cut employee pay or to furlough employees, will these employees secure other jobs by the closing date of the acquisition? And if so, how will you retain their knowledge in order to, that you need in order to run the business? And then the last point is, what future liabilities have been created by the pandemic? Again, this is something that would be looked at in the normal due diligence test, but during the pandemic, there are a lot more litigations that haven't been created. So the acquirer is going to inherit these. What about government investigations? What about IRS audits? Has the target revised or pivoted its regulatory program in light of the changes required by the pandemic? Has it revised or pivoted its compliance program? Has it done so sufficiently? Because if the answers to these questions are no, then the future liabilities will be created for the acquirer and impact the purchase price as well as the future sustainability of the company. So I think the pandemic has really dramatically impacted the M&A activity.
Yeah, it's interesting as you talk through some of those points, right? Just thinking through resources when you look at, the transportation, the impact that transportation has had and what that could potentially, the impact that could have on an M&A activity, right? Those are things that you just don't necessarily weren't at the top of your mind. I would say pre-COVID, it's probably not something I'm thinking about is what could potentially happen to the transportation industry. And those questions, now we're starting to ask ourselves, and we have to make sure that it is part of that due diligence process. Talk about really having to look through the entire chain. We've always talked about that. Make sure you know all the way through the chain of what your first level supplier, second level supplier, potential impacts. I think this has called that out even more. You mentioned a point in here about, looking at the clients, right? So what does their pipeline look like? Do you think that pipeline is going to continue? And what I found interesting about that is what we are seeing is that, some of those clients potentially are not going to be unique, right? Clients on their own, because they're also now looking at some consolidations. So what do you see as far as in the consolidation within the industries? Are you seeing a rise there as well?
Yeah, I definitely think there's going to be an increase in consolidations in industries. The competitive landscape will change as a result of the pandemic. I was on a couple of calls with CEOs recently, and the key differentiator that they cited for companies that will survive in the post-COVID world is liquidity. They all have the same answer. And we're already seeing many large name brand companies filing for bankruptcy because their debt was too high and their liquidity was too low. So the private equity firms are just waiting in the wings to buy these up at bargain basement prices. And I think many companies that have been able to get by in Q1 and Q2 of this year, basically putting a Band-Aid on their businesses, that won't really hold in Q3 and Q4. So I'm that they're going to be looking to sell themselves or to be takeover targets. And I think this is where the industry consolidations, will take place. It's like the story Little Pigs that I read to my 6-year-old daughter recently. Pig built his house out of bricks will sustain its business, but the pigs that built their houses out of straw and sticks will not. And this is exactly what's going to start to happen. You're right, there will be consolidation for sure.
That's a great analogy. Leave it up to children's books to help us with some of that. So I'm going to jump quickly to our next poll question. I also want to take a time to remind all of the attendees, feel free to ask questions. We definitely want to make sure that we're answering any questions that you have. Those will come through. You have an expert panel here, so take advantage of it. So our next poll question, is compliance still its own standalone function, or is that shifting post-COVID? So yes, no, somewhat. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to answer here as well. The good news is you only have three options. Quite a few folks on the line, so I want to give it just a second. All right, let's see. All right. So is it still its own standalone function? Yes. Very strong, 59.4%. 7.3 said no, and then 33.3% said somewhat. So this one's interesting for me because I recall speaking on this topic, for many years in different formats on the desire to pool different compliance functions. Should it be in one area? Where should it reside? Should it be unique and siloed? So Linda, I would love to get your thoughts on that, given our survey results, but then also, what are your thoughts around, should it be a standalone function, and your thoughts around, pulling that together with other functions?
Well, I think it is great that it's standalone in a lot of respects, as long as you get the support from ELT and you get the staffing to meet it, right? So one of the things I think you see in industry today is that if they bury it somewhere else, they really don't properly staff it. If you get it out in the forefront where they can see that this is something that's critical and something that's important, if your management team will respect it, give it what it needs, give it the staffing, give it the resources, give it the ability to get the help from the legal department where they need help from legal department, get the help from the finance department that they need from the finance department, empower them. I guess that's the big thing. As long as you're empowering them to make sure that they can get what they need from the rest of the business, I think it's great. And I think that's what everyone would want.
So Tom, I want to pick your brain a little bit on this one as well, because I know this has been a long-standing question just in, kind of the broad compliance topic. And I know you've had a lot of discussion on this topic as well. So what are you seeing? Does it, I mean, I agree with Linda, right? As long as you have the right level support, you kind of can isolate it and make it a very strong standalone unit. But I know also there's discussions, right, where you're looking at cost savings, or how do you start to use, resources, maybe because you have resource constraints. So what are you starting to see in the industry?
So Holly, this has been something probably, you and I have talked about for as long as we've been in this field and in this discipline. The debate started off, should a CCO be independent of a general counsel? And then the debate became, as you said, are they properly resourced? Do they have the authority? And do they have access to the board of directors? And now we see with some of the regulatory statements and regulators' statements, drilling down even further to ask, do they really have access to information in the company? So is data, for instance, is data siloed, or does compliance have access to data in areas that might be not traditionally seen as a compliance function? HR data, accounts payable data, IT data, CIO data, finance data. So a wide variety of data that's in a corporation's data lake, but a chief compliance officer may not have had access to it previously. So I think the regulators' thoughts are evolving on this to really flesh out some of the things that we have talked about in this webinar, which is, do you have access to the information, and do you have the support to properly do your job? And that's going to be really the next level, I think, of what we see in the CCO and greater compliance realm. But I don't want to say it's an ongoing dialogue, but you can almost see this evolution, certainly as long as you and I have been talking about this. And I think we'll continue to see that evolution as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll continue to see it. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, to Tom's point, my last company, I was there for 9 years, and I watched the evolution of their particular compliance program. It was policies coming out of an overseas headquarters at first, and then it was policies being set up country by country as that country needed it, and they set them up specific for their country. And I think whether compliance is its own function, which it wound up being a standalone function at my previous, whereas it wasn't before, it was a part of legal. I think the key here is that everybody works together and shares resources and shares information. One of the key things that we did when we set up the program for the region that I was in, for the U.S. and Canada, for the North American region, was we did an audit at the beginning of the year, and every department had to do their own audit. So there was a set of questions, because I'm not going to know what's going on in finance better than the finance director will, certainly, and I'm not going to know in supply where some of these risks are better than the supply director. So I think by getting that cross-functional team together where everybody recognizes the importance of these issues, and you do the audit at the beginning of the year, and then we would do quarterly meetings of the heads of these cross-functional teams as well, you can really keep a pulse on what the risks are so that you're staying abreast of it, and you bring in the needed people who have the expertise in that area. You also get commitment from those departments and from those, leaders, because you can't do it without regulatory. You can't do it without supply. You can't do it without all of the teams. There's no way that, whether it's a legal department standing alone or a compliance department standing alone, you need everybody's inputs to possibly know where the risks are and to be able to stay on top of those things. So I think collaboration is really the key there.
Yeah. So I agree. I think that that's a big key, right? You called it out on a couple of points that, no one knows finance better than finance. No one knows supply better than supply. So Linda, just if I jump back, right? So talking about, yes, it makes sense as long as you have the right resources and the commit from your ELT, which I think it's great. You definitely have that. What's a regular cadence that you have for the other stakeholders, such as finance or HR, et cetera, that your compliance team has?
Well, I actually meet with the financial controllers once a month. I meet with the sales leaders every quarter. I meet with the sales teams probably on a more regular basis than the sales leaders. I also meet with IT, and we talk about where we think there could be some kind of cyber issues. Ethics, it never fails for me to be sitting in the ethics office occasionally, just saying, hey, what do you think about this region? What are you seeing? I also talk with supply probably on a daily basis, because supply tended to believe that they were not at risk, right? They think you can always have issues with sales, right? Salespeople can be bribed, but it can happen on both sides, right? So purchasing and sales. So I meet with them probably more often than the rest of the teams, just because it is a less centralized department at Pentair. So I spend a lot of time talking to them. But I also speak with legal and including each of the counsel for each of our segments, and I talk to them on a weekly basis. So it is important that compliance is talking to everyone and relating back, and our finance department makes sure that everyone has been screened. No one can be set up in any kind of ERP system without a screening being put in place. There's fields that make it it's regulated, so they can't move on in their setup process if they don't fill that field. And it's a certain set of criteria that has to go in there, so you can't just put in ABC, right? It's got to be whatever that actual format is. So I think it's important that compliance doesn't just stand alone, that they rely on everyone else to help them.
Perfect. So I will say, one thing, it's funny, I think we're probably all just conditioned to say this. So when you mentioned, right, often you would find yourself sitting in the ethics person's office, having the conversation, seeing what's going on. Now that we can't sit in front of folks, have you found it challenging to keep that regular cadence?
Not at all, because we actually do a ton of WebEx and a ton of Skype calls and a ton of that same type of thing. So we just keep talking and talking, right? It's really what's important for us. And we have regular weekly meetings scheduled.
Perfect. So look, I just switched the slide, maybe a little bit early, but I think we would be remiss, right, if we didn't talk about, kind of regulatory environment and what we're seeing now and what we anticipate. I don't think anyone has a magic ball or anything, but if we didn't talk about this topic. So I want to just pitch it over to you, Tom. given some of the current guidance that's coming out, certainly we're in an unprecedented time, right? What do you see from a regulatory perspective?
So from the regulatory perspective, in terms of compliance, regulators continue to communicate to us. Obviously, in the FCPA, anti-bribery, anti-corruption world, we had the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs on June 1. On July 2, we had the second edition of the FCPA resource guide, but we've had additional information from OFAC in terms of an enforcement action. We've had information from OFAC around the maritime industry and compliance obligations around trade sanctions. And of course, trade sanctions continue to evolve. So we have a continued evolution of regulatory requirements and information. That is coupled with the one clear message we've had from the regulators since March 15 or sort of mid-March timeframe is enforcement will continue. And there's no get out of jail card, Q2 COVID 2020 card you can play, that if you have a concern or you cannot do your operationalize your compliance program, the regulators, DOJ, OFAC, Treasury will listen to you, but don't expect to get a pass. And even more important, 3, 4, 5 years from now, when you find yourself in a full-blown enforcement action, no one's going to remember what happened in June or July 2020. They're going to want to see what is the documentation of your compliance program. And then the last thing is we've had some massive enforcement actions come down this year, certainly in the FCPA world, Airbus, but we had Novartis, which were just massive cases. Novartis was both international and domestic. We had a big arrest of the Speaker of the Ohio House. We had ComEd in Illinois. So the regulators are continuing robust enforcement. We've had robust OFAC enforcement actions. And in the trade sanctions area, literally 48 hours ago, the Chinese consulate was closed in Houston, Texas. And if you don't think that presents a risk, how are you going to get a visa when you had applied at the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas? So the risks are there, but the risks are changing, and they're changing more rapidly. So listen to what the regulators say in your discipline, keep abreast of the major enforcement actions, and then remember that enforcement will continue, and it will continue in a robust manner. If there's something you can't do, document why you can't do it and figure a way to manage the risk in a different way.
So I think you called it out, right? There's no get out of jail free card because we are in a COVID-19 era. So I'm curious. And I mentioned we would reference it. So as we looked earlier, right, we had 43, the respondents said about 43% of their third parties do not go through any due diligence. Do you think given some of the things that we've seen, right, where you look at your suppliers, the impact on, transportation that it's had for some suppliers that you probably didn't anticipate early on. Do you think that now with COVID and then post-COVID era, do you think that 43% will change? Not directly related to regulatory, but there could definitely be an impact there.
Was that directed to me?
I guess anyone really. Do you think that 43% number will change significantly as we come, through COVID and post-COVID?
I'm not sure it will change significantly, but if I could go back to the thoughts I had after the first polling question, your risks are going to change, and they may change more quickly than you had experienced that in the past. So as risks change, you need to be able to pivot your risk management strategy to manage any new risks. So rather than perhaps a dramatic change, you may see a less dramatic or a creeping or evolutionary change, but you need to be ready to manage that risk.
Well, and if I can add to that, I think it's the flexibility right now. Everyone is in a hurry, right? Your supply chain in some cases was either shut down or reduced or restricted, right? So everyone's in a hurry to get new suppliers set up. And everyone is in a rush to make sure that they're not losing any productivity and that they're getting their products out the door as fast as they can. With that being said, regulatory is not going to stop saying that you need to do your due diligence. So you need to still be screening, and you need to still be making sure that you're picking the right partners, and that those partners are picking the right partners. So I think, as much as what Tom was saying, I think it has to be even more enforced post-COVID, right? Or during this pandemic, because we're in a rush. Everyone's in a rush. The boats didn't move. The trains didn't go. The borders are being slowed down. So don't forget that even though you're in a hurry to get goods out the door and get new supply sources set up, that it's critical that you don't miss steps.
Exactly. That's we've certainly experienced that as well with our clients, right? There's definitely a rush, right, to add on new suppliers, and just given some of the impact on some of the other ones. So the good news is we're seeing everyone keep that level of due diligence, which I know can be tough when you're trying to hurry through. So I want to.
If you have a good program,
go ahead.
I think if you have a really good program and your team gets it, right, they're going to stand behind you and they'll do what they need to do. I mean, I guess I'm blessed because I do have a really good team that always wants to do the right thing, and we have a good ELT that supports it. So if you get that message across upline, you're in a great place.
Agree. All right. I see there's quite a few questions coming into the chat. So I want to make sure that we certainly give time. So I'm going to just pop over a quick question. So Kelly, one of the questions that's come in is, what mitigating strategies are you seeing post-COVID, I guess soon to be post-COVID, with regard to managing just reputational risk, even financial risk, from the perspective of third-party diligence?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, you cut in and out a little bit.
Sure. So what mitigating strategies are you seeing that is supporting in a post-COVID environment, managing reputational risk, financial, et cetera, from the perspective of third-party due diligence? I think, Linda, you alluded to some of that, right? It's just making sure that you continue with a strong program that was on the front end. But I guess, Kelly, what are a couple of things that you see as well from a mitigating perspective?
I think when you're doing the M&A work, as well as any other type of work, it's risk management. So the more diligence you can do and the more information you have and the more data you can get your hands on, you can make better informed decisions. I think a lot of the third-party risk mitigation strategies now, if you've implemented them earlier by having strong clauses in your contracts, for example, strong auditing rights, annual auditing rights, et cetera, I think that's a really good thing because, if you're prohibiting your suppliers and your contractors from subcontracting, for example, if they can't do that without prior written approval from you, then you have a better handle on who you're actually working with, not just who you contracted with. So I think a lot of those risk mitigation strategies for the companies that have done that previously and put them into the contracts, they're certainly going to be in much better shape. For the companies that didn't, I think it's still about due diligence at this stage. If one of your suppliers or one of your vendors just doesn't look like they're going to make it, you really need to start, talking to that backup continuity supplier just to make sure that you can get them lined up just in case the other company goes on. You can renegotiate with the company that's not doing so well, but at the end of the day, it's not just about the pricing, it's about getting the materials that you need.
Linda, Tom, anything to add to that before we move to the next question?
Can I just add to that, that's a great point about the contractual clauses, and you typically those are not thought of as much or as importantly, but think about what Kelly said and how you can use those clauses in, if not emergency times, certainly unprecedented times. And that's a clear reason to have those sorts of legal protections as part of your overall risk management strategy, in addition to due diligence, in addition to managing that relationship. Never forget those incredibly important terms and conditions, which should be in every one of your contracts.
Well, in addition to that, I think it's not just onboarding, right, Tom? And I mean, I think it's not just in the onboarding that Tom and Kelly think about it. It's continuous, right? This is something that you need to keep an eye on your partners throughout their life cycle, not just in the beginning, but, you know, go back and check on them again and make sure that you have your audit rights and make sure that you do have your terms and conditions covered before throughout and don't let the contract expire, right? Renew them where you need to renew them and modify them where you need to modify them.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good call out, right? And I think this has definitely, I would say, highlighted the fact that you've got to go back and look at all of your, your current suppliers, so it's not just an onboarding effort. So another question that's come in is, so Linda, when you're having the weekly meetings with the other, with the team members and, some of your key stakeholders, what are some of the, the key questions that you're asking just to make sure that you're getting what you need from a compliance perspective out of those meetings?
Well, we ask if they're having supply issues, if they have new unusual contracts coming in. We ask if they're experiencing any kind of slowdowns, and if they are noticing any kind of problems out of certain regions or certain product lines. We also give them examples of things that we've seen globally, right? So that it may not be something that happened in their region, but we're not afraid to share something that we read or something that is a true example of a finding, right? Like internet sales, right? Let's talk about some of the things that have happened in internet sales so that they're aware and they're paying attention. And we talk about audit a lot, right? And about making sure that we have audits on our suppliers, audits on our customers, audits on ourselves, because we need to audit our own program just as well as we need to audit our suppliers and our customers.
Perfect. So so I know I mentioned it at the very beginning, and we will follow up on all the questions. There's quite a few questions popping in where I know that we will run out of time, as we usually do on the webinars, just given all of the questions that are coming through. So we will follow up if we don't answer your questions directly. But before we do run out of time, I want to take advantage of the panel that we have on with us right now and ask each one to take a minute or two and just give us, your best piece of advice that you can offer to your fellow compliance professionals on the line to adjusting to the new normal when it comes in regards to, the due diligence processes. So Tom, why don't we start with you?
So what I would really ask everyone to think about is their risk profile and how their risk profile can change very quickly. And if I could go back to, I think, a point Kelly raised that really drove home that message for me. If you're looking at an M&A deal and your potential target transports product and they have a robust compliance program, you may focus on that compliance program as part of your due diligence. But what about that transportation program? Are they going to be able to transport their product? Is that transportation put them at risk of any violation of a regulation, whether that be a law like the FCPA or a regulatory requirement? So there may be a new set of risks that you traditionally have not had to worry about that now has come to the fore. And really that example to me, I thought drove that message home as any other message. So your adjusting to the new normal of due diligence may require you to reassess your risk and then manage that risk based upon that reassessment.
All right, Kelly.
I think the best single piece of advice that I usually give to managing risk is to be proactive in general. Don't just, take things on their face, be curious and look behind it and what might be missing. But I think in the post-COVID world, I would add to that, be proactive and be adaptive as well. Compliance professionals are the gatekeepers of the company, ensuring that the laws, regulations, standards, ethical practices are complied with. And when those change, then the compliance professionals need to work with their other departments, legal, HR, regulatory, and proactively stay abreast of what these changes are or what they should be for their particular company and adapt the company's policies and practices to help the company pivot. In an age when budgets and resources are being tightened in the post-COVID-19 world, compliance professionals will really need to be strong, proactive, persuasive leaders in securing the needed resources for their organization, for their department.
So you hit on a point there that budgets being tightened. I think I don't know anyone that's not experiencing that. How about that? It might be easier to phrase it that way, that we're all looking at, especially right now, how do we make sure that we manage those budgets and what to do as those budgets starting to be tightened a little bit. So, would you mind just talking a little bit about that? What are some of the key things that you see, right, as those budgets are being tightened that you need to make sure that, we're all mindful of and that we put probably at the top of the list?
Well, I think it will depend on the organization and the industry because you'll need to prioritize. It's a shift in budget resources. So if you only have, $100 and you have $150 worth of things that you need to do, you need to figure out which of those 100 are the most important ones. It's like we do in our personal lives. So I think the decisions are going to need to be made at a strategic level, certainly with the ELT, deciding which are the biggest priorities and which are the ones that can wait. So for certain companies, maybe there's a bribery risk, and so they need to tighten there a little bit and put some more money there and then divert it from somewhere else. For other companies, they may be under some type of a consent decree, or they might have a monitor sitting on the premises, so they need to divert the funds to that because they have a legal regulatory obligation, a mandate that's in place already. So I think it's going to vary, but I think prioritization is going to be the key to that with the budgets now and the resources. There aren't going to be as many people to do the work. Everybody I talk to, I just lost another person, or, I really needed 3 people before that, and now I've lost 2 people. And I think that's really tough. Someone else I know, her whole department was, folded up into another one, and they all got laid off. So whole departments are being, folded into other departments. And I think that's going to be the challenge. Who takes up that extra work? Because there's only so many hours in the day. So everybody's going to need to reprioritize, and that comes top down from the ELT. How have the business strategies changed, and where do the resources, the headcount, and the money, the budget money, need to be redirected to? I think that's the examination that needs to take place.
Yeah, great point. I think that's a common theme on the resourcing. So I just want to jump over, Linda. What are some of the key things that you can, or guidance and thoughts that you can give to the compliance professionals on the line?
Well, my first thing is don't be afraid to take the time that's needed to do the necessary due diligence based on your risk profile. So think about where your high risk is. That's what you want to attack first. And then it's critical to have automation and do your assessments and continue to look at the processes beyond that onboarding of that new partner. It's one thing to screen them once, but don't forget to go back and look at them, and especially during this COVID thing, because everyone's profile is changing over and over. I mean, as quickly as possible, it's changing again because the economies are changing and the structures are changing. So how many are being acquired? Who's acquiring them? How many are going under? Who's, things like that you really want to pay attention to. And then you also want to teach your teams, right? Make sure that your teams are really aware and they're watching the language and the behavior, and that they have some education behind them to be aware of what could be risky.
So I think that's a key point in the key call out, right, is the training of the teams and the awareness. I think that that's come up a couple of times, I know, in different formats or, industry discussions that I've been having. Is it's critical now that we continue to have that engagement with our team members and that we've got the training and, regular call outs on something that we're seeing that is a little bit different than when you were sitting in the office, sitting next to somebody, or sitting in one of the supplier's office, or, to the point earlier where you can show up, you get that good feeling because you're in their presence, that you don't have that today. So that's a key theme that's continued to come up. Tom, what are your thoughts around that? What are you seeing there as well?
So I'm in Houston, so it's been literally a bloodbath down here in terms of layoffs and budget cuts. The energy industry has had a couple of turndowns, and one of the things I learned from one of the prior turndowns was do less with less. That you're absolutely right. There's only 24 hours in a day, even if you're having to work 24/7. So reprioritize your risk. That ties back to one of the themes we've had throughout this webinar, which is reassess your risk through an updated risk assessment. Figure out what your risks are, your top risks are, and manage those risks more robustly. But if anyone who's ever heard me talk knows what's coming, which is the three most important things are document, document, document. Whatever you do, document it. Start with your risk assessment. Document your risk assessment. Document why you've come up with your risk rankings, and then document how you are managing those risks that you have determined. And that's what the government, and that's what the regulators, that's what the DOJ wants to see, a well thought out, documented program, so that if something does happen, you can continue to get that presumption of a declination, so that hopefully your fine and penalty will be little to nothing.
Great, thank you. So I was just I was just looking. So I love going through these when we do the closing remarks, just to jot down different points. And I think overall, I'm sure our audience heard this, but I'm going to call it out. So the remarks really were centered around, think about your risk profile. What did that look like pre-COVID? What is it looking like now? And how do you revisit that going forward? And then making sure that we're being proactive, right, versus reactive. I think that goes back to there's no get out of jail free card. And I love the point, Linda, that you made. Don't be afraid to take the time, right? Especially given the fact that we know that we're all trying in a rush, right? We're in a rush to onboard. We've got to, take on different suppliers than we had in the past. Don't be afraid to take time. And then, Tom, to your point, document. How do you just make sure, right, that you're reprioritizing and really looking at that risk profile? So any closing comments? We've got 1 minute, and I'm going to take advantage of it in case I missed anything in the summary.
Enable your employees to help, right? But let them know that they're allowed to give you a phone call and tell you something that they heard or something that they read. Local news gives a lot more information than any of us can each watch on a daily basis.
That's a great point, especially now that we're not sitting next to each other. All right, so we are right at time. I very much want to thank our panelists. Really appreciate you coming on. We will follow up with your questions, and thank you for attending.
And Holly, I'll just
Thanks,
close
Holly.
it with a few remarks here. Thank you all for the time, for your compelling presentation today. Before we conclude, I just want to say we value your input, and we would appreciate if you take a moment before you leave to answer the survey that appears on the bottom right corner of your audience console. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers and thank you, audience, for your time and interest today. As we mentioned at the start of the broadcast, you will receive an email with a link to the recorded webcast, a copy of the slides, and other resources, including our third-party risk report. You can also access the recorded webcast on demand using the same audience link that you used today. This concludes today's event.